This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week I'm digging into the story of peat with Ali Morse, Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trusts. We uncover the truth about peat, how much is still being extracted, why government promises have fallen short, and the role horticulture plays in the story. We also look ahead to the solutions, both practical and political, that could finally protect these precious habitats.
My name is Ali Morse and I am the Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trusts. So I sit in the policy team in the central organisation at the Wildlife Trusts. We're a sort of network of affiliated charities that work right across the country. There's a Wildlife Trust wherever you live. There are 46 of us altogether, so operating at local level. And the central organisation works with all of the Wildlife Trusts to support the work that local trusts do. My role is working on policy, so trying to influence what government and business and others are doing around all sorts of things that affect the water environment, and I include within that wetland habitats like peatlands.
Excellent. So somebody reached out to me actually from your organisation, and I think I'm right in saying there's a bill being read in Parliament soon because scandalously there's still a lot of peat being extracted. Is it fair to say the horticultural industry is kind of the main buyer for this peat?
It is, yes. Peat is used for a small number of other things, but peat extraction for use in horticulture is the main sort of volume for which peat is extracted. So peat use in horticulture is something that the Wildlife Trusts and other environmental organisations have been concerned about for many, many years. And as you say, it's scandalous that this is still an issue that hasn't come to a resolution as yet.
And just to be clear, it's for use in mainly compost, is it?
So probably about 2/3 of the use of peat for horticulture is in growing media used by what we'll call amateur gardeners. So what I mean by that is bags of pure peat or other growing media containing peat that are sold in garden centres, in supermarkets, to gardeners like you and I to use in their gardens, their allotments and so on. And then the remainder is what's termed professional peat use, and that is peat that's extracted and used by professional plant growers, so people who grow the plants, the shrubs, the trees that are sold in garden centres. And both aspects of peat use, so the sort of the amateur gardener, the retail peat, and the professional peat use, they have both been falling, but they're certainly not falling as quickly as we would like them to.
No, and it sounds as if this is really something we can influence with our buying decisions.
It is, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest drivers behind the retailers that are going peat-free has been the pressure from their customers. Back in, I think, 2021, the Wildlife Trusts wrote to a number of retailers asking them about their current stocking of peat and about their plans to go peat-free in the longer term. And at the time, we found that there were a small number of retailers that were completely peat-free. There are quite a few others that were working towards that. And we then updated, sort of repeated that survey in 2023. And at that point, we found that many more were peat-free. So now retailers like B&Q, like Dobbies, and supermarkets like Waitrose, Tesco's, Morrison's, Lidl's are all peat-free in terms of their bagged growing media sales. And a number of others had said that they planned to be peat-free by 2024, which was the point at which we had expected there to be a ban on sales. So they had been working towards that. Now, that ban has not yet happened, so it would be really interesting to revisit those retailers and find out where they are with their peat-free journey.
Yeah, absolutely it would. So why hasn't the ban happened?
Well, that is a very good question, and it's something that's been in the pipeline for such a long time. Now, I think it's really interesting to go back in the sort of history of peat campaigning. Way back in 1990, 10 environmental charities, including the Wildlife Trusts, established a peatland consortium and launched a peatland campaign. And this was in response to the sort of growing recognition of the catastrophic harm that was being caused to the UK's lowland raised bogs, which is the type of peatland from which a lot of peat for horticulture is extracted, because we could see that this destruction was completely avoidable. And so that campaign focused on discouraging the use of horticultural peat and encouraging the development and the sale of sustainable peat-free alternatives. And at that time, the data wasn't as good as it is today, but it was estimated that around 3 million cubic metres of peat were used every year by the horticultural sector, and probably about half of that was for amateur gardeners. In 1999, the UK Biodiversity Action Plan for raised bogs set a target for the horticulture industry to be 90% peat-free by 2010. And that target was missed by a large margin. So a study commissioned by government in 2005 actually showed that peat bought by amateur gardeners had risen to just over 2 million cubic metres a year. And a couple of years beyond that, 2011, it had only fallen slightly to around 1.8 million cubic metres. So there have been various ambitions to phase out peat from horticulture. The next was introduced via the Natural Environment White Paper in 2011, where government said, we want to reduce peat use to zero by 2030. And they set various milestones, including a voluntary phase-out target for amateur gardeners by 2020, a target that was also missed. So at that point, recognising that voluntary action was making progress, but it wasn't sufficient, government in 2022 announced that it would finally bring forward a ban on the sale of bagged peat compost by 2024. Now, that was under the previous government, and since then we've had a change in government, we've had a very busy legislative programme, and so we've been told that there has not been space found in sort of parliamentary timetable to bring that legislation forward, which is really disappointing because that announcement of a ban came on the back of a consultation that government ran, and that had 95% of respondents being in favour of the ban. And this wasn't just environmental charities, it was gardeners, it was retailers. Everyone can see the direction of travel. And one of the concerns of some of the retailers who've been a bit ahead of the curve is that they're at a disadvantage compared to other retailers who are still continuing to sell peat. So to really get everyone on a level playing field, it was agreed that that sales ban would be necessary. So it's disappointing that we haven't had that legislation, and that proposal related to the situation in England. The Welsh government had said that it would work alongside government here to implement a ban in Wales, so still no progress on that either. The Scottish government has consulted on banning sales of peat and had previously committed to a ban. And in Northern Ireland, proposals to phase out peat compost sales by 2025 have been dropped as far as we know. So we're lacking in progress across all of the UK nations. So we're really hoping that the piece of legislation, the Private Members Bill that you mentioned earlier, will prompt government to take action.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's difficult to put yourself in the mind of a consumer, and it's probably a difficult thing to research. But what is your perspective on why people are still buying peat? Is it because alternatives are expensive? Is it because there's this perception that they don't work as well? Or is it just a complete lack of knowledge?
I think it's a combination of all of those things. So there is definitely the perception, and certainly there has been historically the perception that peat-free alternatives do not work as well. And I think it's probably fair to say that perhaps some of the earlier peat-free alternatives were perhaps a little bit problematic. But I think part of this is learning to use a different product effectively. I mean, peat itself is used and enjoyed by gardeners because of its properties. It's quite a sort of soft, light and fluffy medium. It's easy to use. It's got no stones or anything in it that would impede root growth. It's really good at holding on to water, and that's one of its key properties. But it's not a perfect growing medium, and it's not actually very nutrient rich in and of itself. So you need to add, liquid feed or something like that, which peat will hold on to very well because it holds on to water. So even peat isn't a perfect growing medium, and where it occurs in nature in our peatlands, those are quite nutrient poor habitats. So gardeners have learnt to use peat, and they can equally learn to use other growing medium just as effectively. And there's been some recent research published which looks at the effectiveness of peat-free alternatives in holding on to water. There's this perception that, oh, you'll need to water your plants a lot more because you haven't got the peat. But actually, with these more modern alternatives, that's proving to be not the case. So another aspect, as you mentioned, is cost. And historically, there has been a cost difference between peat and those peat-free alternatives, which have been more expensive. But when we spoke to retailers, when we ran our survey in 2021, one of the things we found was that a number of retailers were absorbing the cost difference themselves, and they were offering peat or peat-free alternatives at the same price, so that cost wasn't a barrier to gardeners making the more sustainable choice. And finally, one of the other aspects is, as you say, awareness, and that includes things like the labeling of products. So often on the bags of compost on the shelves in the garden centre, it's not very obvious necessarily from the front of the packaging what the product actually contains, whether it contains peat or not. And products that do contain peat will often be labelled with words that seem like quite environmentally positive things: natural product, organic, locally sourced, those kinds of words which you would associate with having positive environmental impacts. But all of those terms can apply to peat. And so they're being used in a slightly misleading way, because we know that extracting peat from our natural environment to use it in horticulture is really damaging for nature and for the climate. And we can come back to the details of why that's a problem later on in our conversation. But that labeling aspect is really important. So often you'll have to turn over these big heavy bags and really pore over the fine print on the packaging to work out whether it actually has peat in it or not. So clearer labeling is starting to help people make a more sustainable choice when they're in the garden centres and the supermarkets as well.
Yeah, that's disappointing that there's a bit of greenwashing going on by the sounds of it. You mentioned the supermarkets that are making the change, and that's really brilliant that there are some retailers that are almost kind of subsidising the cost so that people make a sustainable choice. You don't have to answer this question, but are there any kind of big retailers or manufacturers that you would expect to be leading on this who are just not interested or not playing ball for some reason or another?
I think most of the bigger retailers either are doing really well already or certainly have plans in place. We'd like to see them going faster. And on the Wildlife Trust's website, if you Google Wildlife Trust's How to Go Peat Free, we have a drop-down section on retailers, which lists all of those that responded to our questions and provides details about whether they're peat-free already or what their plans are. So you can see all of that on our website. I think in some cases it's perhaps the smaller retailers who found it more difficult to maybe secure reliable supplies of peat-free alternatives, and perhaps it's been a bit more of a struggle for them. But there are a couple of resources which are really useful that can help gardeners find out where they can buy peat-free alternatives. And those include the RHS website, which has a list of nurseries that are peat-free, both in terms of whether they sell peat-free composts and also what their plant stocks are like. And then there's also a great list from a garden writer called Nick Wilson, who writes for BBC Gardener's World magazine. And she has a list of peat-free nurseries on her website as well. So it's definitely worth people having a look at those if they're struggling to find a retailer that is offering peat-free options.
Yeah, excellent. That's definitely good that we've got resources. And you mentioned the RHS. So in terms of horticultural organisations, are they doing enough?
They have been doing a lot of research around peat-free alternatives and looking at how they can ensure that they can use those effectively in their gardens. But we'd certainly like to see them go further, for example, in things like how they promote peat-free use across all the organisations that they work with, thinking about show gardens and those kinds of things. We'd really like to see all of those being peat-free, because it's these kind of industry leads that should be shining the way for others to see, how successfully peat-free alternatives can be used. And really, we think there are a limited number of circumstances in which it's legitimate to use peat in horticulture. And those might include things like growing rare species for conservation purposes that only grow in peatland habitats. But in most other cases, it really should be possible to grow successfully without relying on what is a very environmentally damaging product.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So you mentioned obviously that we would circle back to the effects of the peat extraction, and actually in the email that you sent to me, it is mind-blowing really how much is extracted and what the effects of that are. Can you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. So it's probably worth starting with why peatlands are important, because they're not necessarily habitats that everyone is familiar with. So peatlands are places where peat soil is formed, and the soil forms in waterlogged conditions. And because of those waterlogged and sort of low oxygen conditions, the plant material doesn't fully decompose, so it builds up as peat. And we have some fantastic peatlands in the UK, places like the Flow Country in Scotland, the Meres and Mosses, the Pennines, the peatlands of Yorkshire, the Somerset levels. So peatlands cover about 12% of the UK land area, and we're actually relatively well blessed with peatlands. They cover about 3% of the land area globally. But because they're often quite sort of large, open habitats, it's quite easy to think that they're practically never ending. There's an endless supply of peat, so it doesn't matter if we take some out for gardening. But that's really not the case. And the reason for that is that, yes, although we have these extensive peatlands, peat is something that takes a really long time to develop. And it forms at a rate of about a millimetre per year. So if you imagine a metre depth of peat, that took 1,000 years to form. And we are extracting and using peat, far more rapidly than it can be replenished. And in terms of the impacts of that, these peatland landscapes provide fantastic habitat for a range of plant species, for dragonflies, for rare birds like curlew and golden plover. And they're home to fascinating carnivorous plants like the sundew, which has these little sticky dots around the edges of its leaves that attract and trap insects that it will then devour. And one of the reasons it has to do that is because, as I mentioned earlier, these peatland environments are actually quite low nutrient. And so it can't get all the nutrition it needs from the soil. And so it has to eat insects to sustain it. But these plants, these sundews and the other plants of peatlands, so things like sedges and mosses, it's those plants that don't fully decompose and don't break down. And in doing so, in forming the peat, this traps carbon because as the plants are growing, they absorb CO2 from the environment through photosynthesis, as do any other plants. But usually when a plant dies and breaks down and decays, that CO2 would be released back to the atmosphere. But in the case of peatlands, all that plant material is kept and locked up in the peat soils. And so these peatlands are a fantastic carbon store. And because they've built up over thousands of years, they store vast quantities of carbon. So they sort of lock in what would otherwise be released back to the atmosphere. And it's estimated that UK peatlands house about 3.2 billion tonnes of carbon. So the destruction of these habitats is really bad from a nature perspective. It's also really bad from a climate perspective. So in terms of the kinds of volumes that we're talking about, the use of peat, as I said, has been falling in the horticulture sector, but not as quickly as we would like it to. So back in 2015, 10 years ago, there was just under 1.5 million cubic metres of peat used in the retail sector, so for the amateur gardeners, and around 700,000 cubic metres for professional use, so that totalling 2.1 million cubic metres. About a third of that was the professional use and 2/3 was the amateur gardener use. If we fast forward to the current picture, the latest data that we've got is for 2023. We're expecting the data for 2024 to be published relatively soon. So obviously you need to kind of wait to the end of the year, tot up the totals, and then it takes a while for that to be kind of collated and verified. So we don't yet have the data from last year, but we have the data from the year prior, 2023. And things have gone down over time quite significantly, around about 390,000 cubic meters in the retail sector and around 370 in the professional sector. So in terms of the ratios, that's a really interesting change. It's now not far off 50-50. So we can see that professional peat use hasn't really fallen as rapidly as amateur peat use has. And even though there's been that significant drop over time, we're still really at quite high figures. So around 750,000 cubic meters in total at the moment, which is pretty high considering that the industry had been expecting there to be a total ban on retail sales in 2024. One of the issues that we've seen within that period is that it hasn't been a sort of constant downwards trajectory. And in fact, peat use has risen at points in that period, particularly in 2020, which of course was the period of the COVID pandemic. And over that time, we saw lots of people spending more time at home, perhaps being furloughed, not able to travel, and enjoying spending time in their garden. And so garden became really popular. And sales of growing media went up really significantly that year. And within that, the use of peat went up. So we saw about 200,000 cubic meters extra peat use that year compared to the year before. But that was a blip, and things have come back down since then. So overall, since 2015, we've seen a decline of about 70% in retail use, of about 45% in professional use, which equates to about a 2/3 decrease overall. So as I said, that's positive. It's going definitely in the right direction. But considering how long the industry has been facing pressure from environmental organisations, from gardeners, and facing the likelihood of a ban, we're really not transitioning as quickly as we should be.
Doesn't sound like it, but actually that raises an interesting point. So during COVID as well, there were obviously transportation restrictions, which leads me on to think, where are the alternatives to peat coming from? Is it stuff that we're shipping in from overseas? In which case, is that just as environmentally damaging, but it's kind of over there, so it's not so important to us? Have you got any research into that?
That's a really interesting question, because I think that aspect applies both to the alternatives and to the peat itself. So in terms of peat extraction, what we use in the UK doesn't all come from here. Some of our peat is extracted from the nations of the UK, apart from Wales, where there is no peat extraction. It has been prohibited. But a good portion of our peat comes from European countries, including the Republic of Ireland and mainland Europe. So in terms of that habitat destruction, we are already causing problems here and abroad as well. In terms of the alternatives, yes, the kind of global footprint of what those products are and where they're coming from is certainly a consideration, because what nobody wants is to stop using peat, but to start using something that's having equal or different forms of harm, particularly elsewhere in the world. And so there are concerns about products like coir, which is often used as a component of peat-free alternatives, which is a component of coconut husks, and we don't grow many coconuts in this country. So yes, certainly the kind of shipping component of how we get these ingredients is a consideration. And that is something that the industry have been looking into in their product labelling, is around not just labelling something as whether it's peat-free or not, but labelling to provide more information about all of the environmental considerations. So in terms of its water use, in terms of how it's produced, whether it takes a lot of water to produce it, in terms of its kind of carbon footprint, in terms of where the ingredients come from, and those kinds of considerations. So certainly that's something that's welcome, so that consumers are better able to make a choice about the products that they buy.
So obviously, as we said, the consumer is key here. The horticultural industry is also key. So particularly if you're buying plants in at quantity or even not, then it's good to do due diligence. Apart from those things, is there anything else that we can be doing at this moment in time to support the bill or to push for change?
Yeah, so we're hopeful that the private members bill will really prompt government to take more notice of this issue. The bill has been put forward by Sarah Dyke, who's a Liberal Democrat MP covering Glastonbury and Somerton. And she's tabled what's called a private member's bill using something called the 10-minute rule, which is a parliamentary opportunity that allows a backbench MP to make their case for a new bill in a speech that's allowed to last up to 10 minutes. And an opposing speech might be made by another MP, and then the House decides whether or not the bill should be introduced. And if they agree that it should, that bill is deemed to have had its first reading. So that's the kind of first hurdle in bringing a bill to Parliament. So it's not only government itself that can bring legislation forward, other members of Parliament can do so as well. And so this is the route that bill has taken. And so it's now awaiting its second reading. And we're hoping that will happen sometime in September. Now, private members' bills don't usually become law, but they often prompt government to take some form of action themselves. So that's what we're hoping might come from this bill. And so it might be that government would take the details of the bill and include it in its own legislation somewhere. So the bill is broadly bringing forward a ban on the sale of horticultural peat. And what we would hope to see is that there'll be some interest from the public, from the media, around the time that the bill gets its second reading in Parliament. And then we'll see where it goes from there. But the kind of things that people can do to support that are talk to their own MPs, ask them to speak up in support of the bill, to go and speak in the debates, and to show support for this issue. Because if government can see that this is something that has broad backing, then they're more likely to take these messages on board and act upon them themselves. One of the things that they might do as a result of this bill could be that they might bring forward some proposals or legislative targets through the Environmental Improvement Plan. So at the moment, we have an environmental improvement plan that was put in place in 2023, and that sets out government's commitments to the environment and a range of legally binding targets that it's obligated to take forward. And that plan was welcomed because of all the things it commits to, but it was criticised because it had no delivery pathways within it. So it said lots of great stuff, but it didn't really have the detail as to how we'd actually get there. And so currently, government is looking to revamp that plan and put some flesh to the bones so that we have a clearer idea of how we're going to actually meet the targets within it. Now, in that refresh, that could be an opportunity to say something about peat, perhaps to commit to a new date for bringing the sales ban forward. So that's something we're hoping government will be looking at, and seeing that sort of level of public support around the timings of that private members' bill debate could be really helpful in driving a response from government.
Excellent. So how can people help make a change?
I think probably the key things that people can do to help drive this agenda are threefold. The first is that they can choose peat-free alternatives where those are available. The second is that they can ask where those peat-free alternatives are not on the shelves. So talk to those retailers, ask them why they're not stocking certain products, and that will demonstrate that there is consumer demand for peat-free items. And the third and final is to support the environmental organisations and others who are trying to drive this message home to government. And that might be through things like sharing on social media, it might be through writing to your MP, and just generally showing support for this movement away from peat that we know is so essential for both nature and the climate.
Thanks to Ali for highlighting this important topic, and to you for listening. If you like this episode, you might also enjoy episode 144, The State of Horticulture with Matthew Appleby, and episode 47, Going Peat Free with John Walker. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.